Good afternoon, and welcome to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. Today, we are talking about the perfect victim when belief becomes conditional. I want to issue a warning to those who might be listening. This can potentially be triggering or traumatic information to potentially listen to, especially if you have been a victim of a crime. So please exercise caution. And know that I am here with you. I understand, but I did want to offer a warning. I remember seeing an exhibit once called "What Were You Wearing?" It wasn't graphic. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't raise its voice. It was just clothes. How would clothes show anything about a victim? But somewhere along the lines, we got the idea that victims were responsible for their attack. That they somehow asked to come into the crosshairs of a monster. A monster who didn't see them as a person, who saw them as a mark or a target through no fault of their own. The survivor who was living their life, had a perfectly normal life, and was not looking out for the monster that was lurking in the shadows. And these clothes weren't what people would think they were. They were normal clothes that people wear every single day, including jeans, sweatshirts, work uniforms, pajamas, children's clothing. Perhaps that's the saddest. I don't know. And what stayed with me wasn't shock. It was the quiet realization that none of it fit the story we've been taught to tell ourselves about harm. That somehow the victim, because somewhere along the way, we learned to believe that pain only counts when it happens to someone who looks, behaves, and responds the right way. Guess what? No one knows how they'll respond before an incident happens to them, especially a traumatic incident, especially a life-altering incident, something that could potentially cause post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, fear, and hypervigilance. The myth we rarely name. There's a belief that we don't say often out loud, that a real victim is easy to understand, easy to believe, easy to defend, because they're virtuous, they're perfect, they did nothing wrong. But ultimately, by the very nature of things, rather than blaming the victim, we need to actually blame the person who perpetrated this crime, the person who set out to find a mark, the person who was the only person who knew what was going to happen. We can't place that on a survivor's head, because how were they to know that they were the mark of that particular person? The perfect victim is calm, articulate, consistent, morally uncomplicated, meaning they don't do things that good girls wouldn't do. They don't drink, they don't they don't wear certain types of clothing, they don't wear their makeup in a certain way. There are many other standards for that. Then you also get into the complicated aspect of how did they act during the crime? Did they fight back? Because if they didn't fight back, then clearly they weren't the real victim. They didn't fight back hard enough. Why not? Why didn't they fight with all they had? Let me tell you a quiet secret that I've learned in representing and working in domestic violence shelters and sexual assault, working with sexual assault survivors. The body keeps the score. The body knows how to react. And when that happens to someone, their instincts kick in. Because yes, Certain offenders will stop when someone fights back. Other offenders will not. It will potentially escalate the violence. And so, unless you've experienced that firsthand, you probably don't realize that. And that's okay. I'm here to educate based on what I've seen and the experiences I've had working with these people, the survivors, working with the survivors. Not using these people as a negative, because I have nothing negative to say about survivors. And here's the thing. If they survived that assault, they won. They survived. That was the whole point. And they did that. So they don't now need to be judged by someone who, A, probably hasn't experienced that, B, has preconceived notions about what victims should look like, or C, just wants to judge someone because they feel that it makes them more superior. Ultimately, we need to have more compassion, less doubt, more trust, more understanding, instead of just pointing fingers. I think of, what is it, Handmaid's Tale? Shame, shame, shame. No. The person that needs to be ashamed is the person that chose a victim and destroyed their life. Because guess what? Their life most likely will never be the same. Can they heal? Somewhat. Can they overcome things? Of course they can. But it's still there, that fear. And I hope none of you ever experience that. And when someone doesn't meet the standard that we feel that they should meet, something subtle shifts. The harm becomes secondary. The person becomes the focus. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Why didn't you do this? Shouldn't you have? Why didn't you? Couldn't you have? Because, playing Monday morning quarterback for something like that, that's a traumatic experience where at times your brain may not be fully communicating with the rest of your body. Sure, they should have been in full control of their capacity. They should have known that they should have done A, B, and C. Did they call the police immediately? Did they shower before or after? All those questions that they're being judged on. All those questions. And to add to it, there are some law enforcement officers and some SANE nurses, which are the sexual assault nurses, who are less than complimentary, who want to warn survivors that, it only takes one time to get AIDS. Did you know that? It only takes one time to get AIDS. Yeah, well, maybe this person didn't choose this encounter. Maybe they were actually a survivor of the encounter. Or a law enforcement officer that says, yeah, I don't think that you should prosecute this. I don't think, I might even charge you with false informing. How's that for law enforcement? Not good, is what I will say. But not because people are cruel, but because the myth serves a purpose. Let's talk about why this myth exists at all. The idea of a perfect victim protects the observer. If harm only happens when rules are broken, then you know what that tells the observer? I'm not going to break those rules. And then the world feels more comfortable for them. If suffering is earned, then safety feels negotiable. But guess what? That's not how it works. Because there's people out in this world that we don't realize are predators. We would have no way of knowing that they're predators. And so even though we have this rose-colored glasses of how things happen and that there's an order, and some people buck the order, which is why this happened to them, that is not true. And there is no perfect victim. It allows people to believe if I do everything right, this won't happen to me. Ideally, that would be great, but that's not the reality. And we all know it. We see it. I believe it's up to 1 in 4 women or 1 in 3 women in their lifetime will be a victim of sexual assault. So it is a pretty serious condition. The belief is comforting, yes. I would love for it to be true, but it's not. And when reality threatens the illusion, the discomfort doesn't disappear, it gets redirected. When belief starts to waver, once a victim doesn't fit the expected mold of how we think they should act, maybe they're not crying, maybe they're completely calm, probably because they're in shock. And did you know that when you go through something traumatic like that, your brain shows you things in snippets? So oftentimes the things that people point to in jury trials is the fact that the victim's story or the survivor's story was nonlinear. Because when you have a traumatic incident, it doesn't always put it together correctly and in order. It fragments it because your brain puts it in different areas. And when reality threatens the illusion, the discomfort doesn't disappear, it gets redirected, as we said. And so the questions change, not what happened, but who are you? How did you respond? Why didn't you act differently? Didn't you notice that he was following you? Or did you know that you didn't know him? Are you sure? Is that what actually happened? You know what? I just talked to your friends outside and they said that you were in a relationship with this man. Again, trying to trigger you, trying to put it onto the survivor. Scrutiny replaces urgency, and this is often framed as objectivity. But oftentimes I think that some police officers get jaded and they think that everyone is lying to them and that this doesn't happen as often as people think that it is. It's a disgruntled, emotional woman who just wants revenge, right? Did you break up with her recently? How did you stroke her ire somehow? But objectivity isn't neutral when suspicion flows in only one direction. Media narrative and credibility. Media doesn't just report facts, it frames them. Words like troubled, complex, high risk, known to police. These aren't neutral descriptors. They're filled with judgment and condemnation. They are credibility signals. And once they're attached, belief becomes fragile. Not because the facts changed, but because the story did. Institutions and the cost of discomfort. Institutions are made of people under pressure, scrutiny, and fear of being wrong. When a story is messy, urgency slows. When a victim is complicated, caution increases. Complexity is mistaken for unreliability. Uncertainty is treated like guilt. And this is where something important needs to be said carefully. When systems fail quietly, sometimes victims don't just experience disbelief. Sometimes they experience pressure. There are documented situations where victims are discouraged from pressing charges because the officer says, I wouldn't press charges if I were you. There's no way this case is going to land. They're warned about consequences rather than being protected. Did you know you could be charged for false informing? Yeah, that is actually a real crime. And if you are reporting a sexual assault that didn't occur, you could be charged for false informing. In fact, I may give you false informing charges. In my personal experience, when I was helping at the rape crisis shelter, there was an officer who was literally charging women with false informing at an alarming rate, which to me seems like a huge red flag because rather than protecting the women, he's protecting the men who the women have said have harmed them. And there are cases where law enforcement officers have prevented advocates, sexual assault advocates, from coming to help the victim, especially right as they're going to the hospital and trying to report their story and go forward with that. They're told their case could backfire on them, and they're contacted later with threats of prosecution. And in some cases, when a victim tries to step away, they're met with anger instead of care. And oftentimes people aren't given updates, so they don't really know what's going on with their case, and they're afraid and they may be afraid that the perpetrator is going to come back and find them, which is terrifying. Statements like, "How dare you take my case away from me?" That kind of response isn't about justice, it's about ego. It's about guiding a case that they feel that they do not agree with, and they're trying to silence it. It's about control. And it places the burden back on the person who was already harmed. And what this does internally, when belief is conditional or when authority becomes threatening, something shifts inside. People begin to doubt their own memory. They soften their language, they minimize their pain, and they stop reaching out. Not because they're dishonest, but because belief or intimidation teaches people to protect themselves. Silence becomes a survival strategy. Silence is not healing. Silence is often mistaken for strength or composure or resilience. But more often, silence means I learned what happens when I speak. And I choose to not speak because I choose to not be bullied. I choose to not be abused. I choose not to be prosecuted for something that I didn't do. And then the other thing you think about, many of these women may not have health insurance. So when they go to the ER, because that's where they go to get the kit and all that other stuff, then they are saddled with the idea of having to pay an emergency room bill. And that could be $3,000 to $4,000, $5,000, whatever it is now. And then you have this scenario where there is a victims' compensation fund in a lot of states. And I know of an experience where someone filled out the form, but the hospital refused to submit it for whatever reason. It was probably because the nurse she should never have been a SANE nurse, to be honest, but she was a SANE nurse, and I think she chose to disregard it. But there was finally a negotiation that was made that allowed it to be refiled at a later date if the survivor would cooperate, and they did. So that kind of did that. But I do think that certain people need to stay out of the decision-making lane because clearly they're not qualified and they have biases that keep them from fully knowing and discerning what is actually going on. And we know that it shows up, unresolved harm doesn't disappear. It shows up as chronic self-doubt, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting authority or others, especially law enforcement if you've had that deal with being threatened by a law enforcement officer, a sense of being unsafe even after the danger has passed. And because there was no clean resolution, people often blame themselves for still hurting, as if pain should expire on a schedule, which we know it never does. So I want to let you know that I am standing with the listener on this. And if any part of this resonates, if you've ever felt the pressure to stay quiet or punished for speaking or made responsible for managing other people's discomfort, there's nothing wrong with you. Your pain didn't become smaller because others couldn't hold it, because you yourself were holding it and you were holding it well. And your worth was never dependent on how perfectly you explained what happened. Because for some people, no matter how articulate you are, no matter how well spoken you are, no matter how sincere or how real your words are in your description, how distinct and descriptive it was, it would never have been enough. Because people are oftentimes not willing to hear what they're not willing to hear. And that has nothing to do with you. What this episode is and what it's not. This isn't about condemning every officer or every institution or every system. It's about naming a pattern that exists. There's a reason why this is titled The Perfect Victim. It's almost a tongue-in-cheek title because there is no perfect victim, right? There's no perfect victim. They're who we want to be the victim, right? Who we would believe more, but that doesn't mean anything. Because you rarely get a perfect case, nor would you want a perfect case. What we would want is we would want people to be listened to, treated with respect, treated with empathy, like they're human beings who've experienced a traumatic episode, an incident that's going to be with them for the rest of their lives, and to give them compassion and help them on their way with healing, doing our job correctly, not being judgmental, and being empathetic, because that's very important. It's about naming a pattern that exists and the human cost when protection becomes conditional, based on what you did and what you didn't do. Justice doesn't require perfection, and belief shouldn't come with threats. So in closing, if your pain was overlooked, minimized, complicated, or quietly pushed aside, it doesn't mean it wasn't real. Pain is personal, and while it may stay with you for a time, it will not always feel like this. Day by day, it will get less and less. And maybe, just maybe, you can help someone else. Or maybe, just maybe, there's a silver lining to this. Whatever it may be. Maybe you may find a calling in your life that you've been looking for. Maybe you will find courage to do something that you've always wanted to do. Maybe you'll help someone else along the way. Maybe you'll found a nonprofit or something. You never know. I truly think sometimes we land where we're meant to. So in closing, final closing, I want to say you deserved belief, not because you were perfect, but because you were human and you matter. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I hope that you will tune in again to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you all.